That's a mature Graafian follicle. So this is one that's just getting ready to ovulate. Usually what happens most times, every cycle, one follicle is maturing a little bit ahead of the other ones, and through hormones it inhibits the development of other follicles. So for this, it might have taken 3, 4, 5 menstrual cycles for this follicle to get to be that size to where it's actually mature. So follicles develop for a while, but then one follicle typically is ahead of the game and it inhibits the development of other follicles. They kick in again the following cycle, they grow a little bit. Next cycle, they grow a little bit. Eventually, they get to be a mature follicle. Here's the oocyte. Can't tell from a slide like this whether that's a primary or secondary oocyte. Impossible to tell. A mature Graafian follicle finishes, the oocyte finishes meiosis 1 literally right before you ovulate. And right on meiosis 1, you get a secondary oocyte, which then is going to rupture through the wall of the ovary and enter into the fallopian tubes. So really, this could be a primary or a secondary oocyte. We just don't know how close it is to ovulation. But the whole thing is a mature Graafian follicle. It's got that very distinct shape. As it develops this big space in there called the antrum that contains follicular fluid, which has nourishment effects and stuff like that. And this is where the oocyte is. Again, it could be primary or a secondary oocyte. Float around, look at the periphery here. Keep in mind how big that one is. This is like pretty good right here, although there's a better secondary follicle. You see these little tiny guys in the periphery? And this is all ovarian cortex on the periphery. These are, if you take like the really smallest ones, like something like that, that would be a primordial follicle. You can barely make out any detail. If that's a primordial follicle, then maybe these are primary follicles. They are a little bit more developed. This would just have it come down here a little bit. You might call this an early stage secondary follicle, but I believe this particular slide, oops, come over here a little bit, is a really good secondary follicle, if I recall. Right there, that's like a late stage secondary follicle. It's starting to get that, you can see the development of the antrum. We're not going to get into all the details. We'll talk about more details in the, here's the oocyte surrounded by the corona radiata, a bunch of cells that'll come out with it when it ovulates and all that. But still a primary oocyte, but development of an antrum. You can tell by the sheer size if you compare that to this guy over here. That's definitely a mature Graafian follicle, getting ready, ready to ovulate. So really, it's kind of like size. Secondary follicle there as well. So if you look on a test, you go on the very periphery and you see little tiny dots like that. For something like this, I would accept one of two answers, either a primordial follicle or a primary follicle. They're really tiny, early stage development. They're going to contain primary oocytes. Down a little further. Again, now you're starting to get bigger. That one right there, probably call that an early stage secondary follicle. But if you saw something like this, you should get there. That's the ultimate example of a secondary follicle. Still got a primary oocyte. Primary oocyte has how many chromosomes? Still has 46. Not until you ovulate, meiosis 1 has just been completed, that you're going to have the first time for a female the haploid number. So that's what's going to meet the sperm. If you look, you see the lighter colored material? A much less dense type of connective tissue. All this in here would be the ovarian medulla. Whereas if you go way out in the periphery, see the connective tissue looks a lot denser, it's a deeper purple. That would be the ovarian cortex. That's really it. I don't know if that's a remnant of a corpus luteum right there. I would guess that it is, this big filled-in area. When that secondary oocyte ovulates, the ruptured follicle is going to be under the influence of luteinizing hormone and turn into an active endocrine gland called the corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow, corpus means body. And this is pretty much what a corpus luteum looks like. They'll last there for a little while secreting hormones, and they'll degenerate into a corpus albicans. Some of the posters show that pretty good. But that would be my interpretation of what you would see with the corpus luteum, which just looks like a filled-in Graafian follicle. And it starts secreting some important hormones, in particular like progesterone. What's the nickname of progesterone? Everybody's heard of it. Some people call it the pregnancy hormone. So progesterone levels, the second half of your cycle, you get a spurt of progesterone coinciding with the development of the corpus luteum. You assume you stereotypically ovulate on day 14, right? So right immediately after ovulation the next week, you have the development of the corpus luteum, which starts secreting progesterone. As long as you have high progesterone, you're not going to have a menstrual flow. So progesterone at elevated levels maintains the pregnancy. There's other factors that are involved. If no fertilization takes place, corpus luteum starts to degenerate, progesterone goes down, you have a menstrual flow. And that stuff will, the female cycle is complicated, I'll tell you what, it's not surprising.